Hello again, everyone. We're going to have our final lesson for this week. And this is going to be a lesson on how to create a gradient. A gradient being a color that we can add to the background of your web page that goes from light to dark, either up or down, left or right, depending on how you set the parameters. But the gradients that do this will give you a little bit more depth when you look at the web page, and it creates an interesting effect. And you can put gradients both in the background of your whole body of your document, or you can put it in different elements of your document. So let's open up the Hello World in let's see here. Let's open it up in Safari, and let's see. This is what a gradient looks like. You'll notice that we went from having that white background to having a background that goes from light, a very light gray, all the way down to a darker gray. And this actually sets things off very nicely in the browser window. And as you add elements, there are other things that you can do as you add elements to create even more depth by adding a gradient as a background. You can also have gradients as background within these boxes if you know how to set your gradients. And so let's go ahead and get out of Safari real quick. And we're going to let's get out of Safari, and we are going to, once again, hold on, let's open up, there we go, open up our web page, and then open it up again so that we can see the code in Text Wrangler. Now again, we have our very nice and elegant text that doesn't have a lot of HTML, but the CSS is where we get all the style. So if we want to give gradient to the body, all of this white space that surrounds our paragraphs, then what we need to do is we need to begin setting up the CSS code to do that. So let's tab over and say, well, we want the gradient to be on the body, and we get this from the body tag that exists within the HTML document here. So the body that contains all of this will have our gradient. So body, open and close curly brackets. Let's put some space there. And now what we're going to do is, in order to get our gradients, now gradients have a good bit of a code that goes with them. It's a little bit difficult to memorize. So what we're going to do is we're going to cheat a little bit. We're going to Google up CSS gradients. And the first hit is one of my favorite hits, Web Designer Wall. Web Designer Wall is a site that gives you a lot of interesting tutorials and tips on how to do some things that are, interesting that you might not have thought about doing for your website. And on this particular page for this site, we have a tutorial on how to create cross-browser gradients. What we mean by cross-browser is we're going to create the code that will allow your gradient to work in all of the major browsers that people use: Firefox, Safari, Chrome, and Internet Explorer. Now, the code for each one of those browsers, to get the gradient to work in each one of those browsers, is going to look different because gradient code is proprietary to each one of the browsers. So for WebKit browsers, which means WebKit browsers are Safari browsers, Chrome browsers, any browser that uses what is called the WebKit engine to actually read the code. And so for Safari and Chrome, we're going to use this code, which looks like this. For Firefox 3.6 and above, we need to use this line of code, which looks different, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And then finally, for Internet Explorer, you'll need this line of code. And this is for Internet Explorer 8 and above. All we have to do is, once we get to this site or a site that gives you the code, we just highlight it, copy, and we're going to paste the code right there into our CSS. And what we want to do is, so it'll work in all the major browsers again, is to copy, cheat a little bit by copying and pasting that code. And then finally, Internet Explorer. And once we take a look, if we take a close look at the actual code, we'll see, okay, we have our body selector, and then the code that actually creates the gradient background for the gradient. For this line of code, for WebKit, which means we're going to be, this is for Safari and Chrome, gradient, linear, meaning in one direction, from left top to left bottom, all the way down from top to bottom, from this color to this color. Now I've been using hexadecimal code to create our colors, but this is RGB. The fact that we see 3 letters instead of 6 or 3 numbers instead of 6 means that this is RGB, which means that each letter or number represents a shade of red, blue, or green, and that's what gives us that mix of colors and shades gives us the color that we want. But so we're going to go ahead and use that for this example. You'll notice that for Internet Explorer, this line of code, for Internet Explorer, they're using hexadecimal probably because they don't really read RGB that well, that browser window. But anyway, so these are the 3 lines of code that we need. So we're going to set those lines of code. We're going to go up here and we're going to save. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to our window that has that's displaying our web page, and we're going to refresh. And oh my goodness, look at that. What happened? Well, there's supposed to be a gradient, but we have what looks like the grill of a car or something here. We made a mistake. What we needed to do was also establish how far we want the gradient to go. Just like when you're trying to set an image as a background, if you don't tell the browser, for instance, to use the image only one time, or however many times you want to use the image, it's going to keep repeating that image. And so what you have is you've set the gradient to only go a few pixels, but then it'll keep repeating itself. So what we need to do is go back to our code. Okay, well we know we have a gradient. It's a working gradient, but how do we make it a gradient that goes from just one solid color from top to bottom? Well, or a gradient from top to bottom, and doesn't look like a grill of a car. Well, we have to set the height attribute for the gradient. And what I like to do is just for because people have different size screens, what I do is I set it at a height of 1000 pixels at first to see how that works. Don't forget the semicolon. Then we're going to save. And again, this line of code is telling your browser that the gradient of the body is going to be 1000 pixels in height from top to bottom of the screen. Refresh. Now there we go. That's a nice smooth gradient that goes from a light gray and really actually white at the very top all the way down to the bottom of the screen, which is a darker gray, and then if you scroll down, a black. Now it doesn't have to go down that far. What we can do is if you don't want to have to scroll very far, we can set this at 700 pixels and refresh. Okay, and so you'll see your darkness has just moved up a little bit, and we don't have to scroll as much. Now what we have is when we open the browser window, our gradient will stop at the bottom at the 700 pixel mark. And you can make that bigger or smaller as you wish, but that is essentially it. That is how you create a gradient. So to go over it again, you want to set your selector. You want the gradient to be in the body. You want it to have a height of 700 pixels, otherwise you're going to get that car grill look. And then you set the actual gradients using these lines of code. And the easiest way to you can study this and memorize these lines of code, or you can just Google up CSS gradients and pick up the code from somewhere else. Now, we don't have to use this color. We can change the color, for instance. We can go from, and I'm just using random color codes here, we can go from, let's say gray, and I'm going to use hexadecimal code. We're going to go from gray to, and I don't know the code for red, but I'm going to say red. And just let's see what happens. Maybe nothing, but we'll see. And since this is for WebKit, it's okay that we're not going to change. We're just testing it in Firefox or in Safari. There we go. So we went from gray to a dark red in this particular example, just to see what would happen. Interesting. So we're going to leave it there for the moment because I kind of like it. We can do this with, we can actually set gradients within your paragraphs as well. Each paragraph can have a different gradient also. What I would do is just take the code that we have here, copy it, and let's say in paragraph 2, which is in blue, instead of having background color blue, we're going to comment that out. And then we're going to paste our gradient code, and let's just see what it looks like. So paste your gradient code within the paragraph 2, and let's see how this box changes. Let's refresh. Aha. So that might be interesting to you. Let's try different colors, and what you want to do is you want these to look the same in all the browsers, so you need to put the same code that I'm putting in on this line of code for the colors in this one and this one in the appropriate spots as well. But let's take a look at what we have. Instead of gray, let's try, let's see if purple works. I don't even know if purple works as a color. Let's say purple and from top from the purple to green at the bottom. I don't know if this is going to work, but let's see if those colors actually work. Yes, they do. And so now we have gradients that go from purple top down to green bottom. And again, you can see how this is starting to add some interesting texture to your web page. Now, when we come back and continue this lesson, these lessons next week, these tutorials next week, I'm going to default back to black and white, and we'll create some gradients that I personally actually think are more aesthetically pleasing. And that's because I'm still of the opinion, if we go back and we get rid of that, we change this, and go back up here, and let's change that back to CCC and hash 000. Save that. Let's put it back to the gradient it was. I'm going to stick with the gray gradient for now as we continue through the lesson, mainly because I really am of the philosophy that when you're building a website, web page or a website, especially at the very beginning of the creation process, you want to have a good idea of how you want to start your page, but you want to start off with less. You want to start off with just the bare bones of what you think you're going to need in order to make the site work. And what I mean by starting with less is the philosophy, the design philosophy that a lot of people use, which is less is more. We start out with less and then continually add some things rather than just kind of throwing everything in with flashy pictures and crazy stuff all over the place. If we experiment with just scaffolding at first and some textures just to see what we get, I think that you end up in the end with more interesting designs that are more pleasing to the eye and that are more readable. We always have to remember when we're designing these sites, we want our sites to be readable and we want them to be navigable. So next time we come back, we're going to play around a little bit more with these colors and textures to get them where we want them to be. And we're also going to talk about navigation. And navigation next week is going to be very important because a lot of times when we start adding pages to your site, a lot of times people who are new to building web pages will put links all over the place in places that aren't obvious or not enough links. And so you end up restricting where your visitor can go within your site. What you want to do is you want to create links that allow your visitor to go where they want to within your site, and that these links are in an obvious spot that's intuitive and makes your website easy to use. But that's going to be lesson 6, and we'll talk about that all next week. I will see you later. Y'all have a great weekend.